Well, just a couple of weeks left in this decade. So let's take a look back at the decade that was. At the start of this decade, the internet, a very different place. How have platforms like YouTube changed over the last 10 years? And are we better off today than we were back in 2009? Joining me on the line is the founder of one of YouTube's most popular channels, Watch Mojo. Ashkan Karpafrushin joins me on the line. Hi, Ashkan.
Hi, how are you? Happy holidays?
Yes, happy holidays to you too. So, I don't know, I'm going to make you encapsulate this answer. Do it as well as you can. Is the internet a better place 10 years, after 10 years, if we look back from 2009 to 2019?
It's a better place. It's more mature, less idealistic, but it is net, I would say, in a better position overall.
Really? You would say it's better?
Of course. I mean, look, there are actors like Facebook that may be a net negative to society, but I think overall, if you really had to just look at how, the combination of computers, internet, World Wide Web, mobile devices, just think of the ease, think of the simplicity, think of how much it has ultimately helped your life. When you're traveling, you could FaceTime with your kid.
Mm-hmm.
You could be, sitting in a cafe in Greece and somebody says, oh, you forgot to do something. You open an email and one button instead of scrambling around, faxing, printing. If you really overall take a step back, away from the hysterical headlines,
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely think that as human beings, technology and the internet and all that has made it better. But of course, there's going to be outliers and bad apples.
So I'm going to, listen, I think technology's gotten better. And I think, there are a lot of tech companies that are making life easier for a lot of people. But where I think it gets murky is when it comes down to social media and also, companies like YouTube and the algorithms. Why don't you tell me a bit about that? And as you see it, listen, your bread and butter is YouTube. So
yeah, I mean, but taking aside that bias, okay, so that's a very fair question. I would say that if you look at what's happening in media, you are seeing traditional media companies like Disney, NBC Universal, even Bell Media, essentially almost blow up their business models to go direct to consumer. Mm-hmm. So if you flip that as an individual, whether you're a storyteller, whether you're a designer, programmer, as an individual, there is more power in your hands than ever. If you are in the storytelling business, it's a great time to be in business, so to speak. So I think YouTube has changed, whereas like a decade ago, there was this new platform, the internet and YouTube, and, where distribution was changing, right? You had the portals like Yahoo, AOL, MSN that owned the audiences. And you did see a changing of the guard with YouTube and Facebook and, Apple and obviously Netflix and Amazon. So the distribution leaders have changed, and where they are now differentiating is through content, right? Where the nuance is 10, 15 years ago, there was no economic incentive for the traditional content owners like Disney and NBC and Fox to put their super premium content online. So if a decade ago you wanted to seize on this opportunity as a storyteller, as an entrepreneur, you almost had to fill that gap and say, what kind of content do I need to produce to serve audiences who are increasingly online but not necessarily being served by this super premium content that's still on television? If you fast forward a decade, that landscape has changed where, again, businesses are blowing up their business models to go direct to consumer. So the opportunity now is actually playing that, serving these huge behemoths like Disney that have a lot of content, but surprisingly not enough to serve the insatiable appetite of audiences who now, because of mobile devices, spend far more time engaging and consuming content. And then on the other end of the spectrum, how do I serve these massive platforms, not just YouTube and Facebook, but also Snap and Twitch and TikTok, who need premium content because that's ultimately what advertisers want.
So let's talk a little bit more about content, because it is such an important word. And it is really what everything that's going on right now is based upon. For everyone who's listening, I was speaking with Ashkan Karpafrushin. He's the founder of Watch Mojo. If you've watched a top 10 list on YouTube, chances are it came from Watch Mojo. Now, Ashkan, you're using Watch Mojo to provide, entertainment. You talked about a whole bunch of other companies there, from Disney to Bell Media, all producing lots of content. But I trust the content that you produce. I trust the content that these other big companies produce. Here's what I think has happened in the last decade, though, is that anyone and everyone can produce this content, and it gets put at the same level as yours on YouTube. even if it's, not very good for society. And I'm talking about the conspiracy theories and some of the, the politically motivated videos. Do you think that over the course of the decade, companies like YouTube and Facebook have dropped the ball when it comes to making sure not all content is equal?
The short answer is yes, because I think fundamentally it goes back to the DNA of these companies growing generally out of San Francisco, the Bay Area, where it was a very laissez-faire approach, and they really wanted to be platforms. Some could say altruistically because they were naive that, hey, we don't control the message, anybody has the freedom of expression. But I think to some extent it was more of a business decision where they said, you know what, we're fine having a 90% confidence level that there's going to be a 5% margin of error, so to speak, with what gets put on these platforms, and we will be reactive, taking advantage of things like the Telecommunications Act, and that gives us these safe harbors where we're not going to be accused of wrongdoing if somebody uses our platforms to say hate speech or whatnot. Now, I think times have changed where, at some point in traditional media that you were a printer versus a publisher, those lines got blurry. And I think similarly, conceptually, that has changed now where governments, and actually the leadership is coming from the EU, where they have very rigid stance around hate speech and Holocaust denying, for example, where they're saying, no, sorry, Facebook, if somebody puts Holocaust-denying content on your platform, you're absolutely responsible. And because now media is more global and not local, then Facebook has to apply this worldwide. So you are seeing a change reluctantly, begrudgingly. It's not like Mark Zuckerberg is voluntarily, out of the goodness of his heart, saying, okay, we're going to adapt and take on this responsibility. I think they're basically being forced, and that's where, I call myself an ethical capitalist because I think government can play a good role, and I think to some extent you're doing it. You're seeing it there because these platforms are just kind of laissez-faire, doing what they want. Now, your other question, or another way to answer your question is, yes, the disruptors will themselves get disrupted. And I think you are seeing that. You may not love this, but I like competition, and you may not like this, but if somebody now does a podcast, sure, to a consumer, there's maybe no difference between that podcast and Elias, even if you are running a more professional operation, so to speak. I think that's where this new generation is taking things, where, yeah, sure, the kid that uploads something to TikTok, it's information, it's entertainment, it's mind share, it's watch time. And yes, it is put on the same platform as something that may be on Disney, which is very hard for people that have been in the media game for, I would say, even 5-10 years to accept. But I think ultimately the same way that when you were in school, you knew you had the teacher that was really kind of on the ball and he or she never was wrong, and then the teacher that was a bit more wrong and just was not necessarily up to the same level, you understood instinctively that, you could trust one more and the other one you kind of had to take things with a grain of salt, as crazy as it may seem. So I think you're going to see one, that self-correcting mechanism. And look, you're going to have the same way you have reviews for things like e-commerce. I think there are going to be entrepreneurial minds that are going to find ways where they could differentiate not just fake news from actual, factual, correct news, but where you are going to see people who are more, for lack of a better word, correct, who don't make mistakes, who are not, peddling in propaganda and fake news, be, differentiated from the anything goes model, where now, it's like we always talk about what inning is it? And I go, well, it's not really a question of what inning is it. It's like it's a best-of-7 series. And I would say right now
what game is it?
Yeah, that's it. It's probably the third or fourth game, to be very candid with you. And if you see that, right, I mean, if you take a look at Google, Amazon, and all these companies, one, from a growth perspective, these are massive enterprises valued at $1 trillion market capitalization, but they're not growing the way that they used to, so you can't argue that it's the first inning anymore. And I think now that you're seeing the traditional media companies like Disney, NBC, literally Time Warner, Warner Media blow up their businesses and go direct to consumer, again, you can't say it's the first inning. It's almost like it's midway through this game. I think what you're going to see is time management. Things are, ironically, the pace of change is going to accelerate in the next few years, but things are going to go a bit slower at the same time, meaning it's a game of chess, and more or less, like the first few moves have been made, and now it's a lot more like thinking a few steps ahead. So it's a fantastic time to be alive and to be working, but it's a stressful time, an anxious time, because there's so much change going on.
And I hope for you, Ashkan, that the next decade is one that doesn't bring you stress, but a lot of growth. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Ashkan Karpushin, founder of Watch Mojo.